Okay, so readjusting to life in your own country after living abroad for some time is a little like recovering from jet lag after a long flight. It takes time. Research indicates that after 9 years living in a foreign country, you never really do readjust. Of course, things have changed. Governments have come and gone. What you knew as countryside has become a suburb. New technologies have changed the way people go about their daily lives, and so on. So it's in that list there that the way that they go about their daily lives has changed over. They're saying over 9 years. If you're away for 9 years or more, so I guess they're pointing out that some of those are things that we expect to happen. Governments change, new technologies, but that their subsequent effects, the way people go about their daily lives, um, mm, I think that's what gets elaborated in what follows. It is in the smaller everyday things that you might experience what is known as culture shock. So that's what they're focusing on. So it's actually how it develops in retrospect. You can see that they don't really want us to focus on technology or government. They want us to focus on everyday life. Is when you are kind of expecting one way of doing things and you encounter quite a different way of doing things um, in everyday life. So uh, I think they mean like um, so for example, you might be shocked that people are going, they don't want to go out and have dinner at restaurants very late. You might be surprised at how many people are out early, um, you know, doing doing exercise and all and so on, rather than coming out later. So that could be a bit of a shock, or you might be surprised at the ways um, that certain kinds of conversations are supposed to happen. I think that's what they mean. Like, if you're making small talk, what sorts of things do people talk about? Yeah, it's implied, but they say those are not the main difficulties, however. It is in the smaller everyday things. So they're referring back and suggesting that there are difficulties, and then they're talking about the idea of shock, although they say it's not really a shock. So shock implies some difficulty or some barrier, right? So it's strongly implied that these are things that you might find difficult. Government and new technologies and changes to the countryside. So that the main focus of the previous sentence, I think, is these aren't the main difficulties, the changes that you'll have to adapt to. Um, Smaller everyday things. So it's in the things, the smaller everyday things. So they're just using a comma to break up the adjectives that apply to things. Um, yeah, so what they're saying is that it is smaller things that you will have the most trouble with, but everyday things. No, they're saying it's not the big changes that people struggle with. That is, it's not the change of government or the new technology. It's the ways that people do things in the small places in their lives, that is in their everyday life. So there's an implied contrast between like big capital P politics, like which government is in power, what have been the big decisions of, or the big controversies of the day, versus what people do in their everyday lives, like how they do their grocery shopping or how they schedule their time or um, what what they make small talk about. No, it's referring forward. It is in these things that you might experience culture shock. So they're saying, um,
So which one actually? Because the sentence there is a period here after shock, so there is nothing after it is in the smaller everyday things.
It is the smaller everyday things that you might experience. It is in the smaller everyday things that you might experience. So what they're saying is you might experience smaller everyday things as shocking or
Yeah,
difficult.
I got it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah.
So
But
it's kind of referring
mm,
forward in a way.
yeah. So these kind of smaller everyday things can be the ones that you mentioned. For example, people do exercise at 4 a.m. Is it like that? Yeah. Yeah, I got it. It doesn't mention anything specifically, but it is a general things, the
So
smaller
it goes
everyday
on, it
things.
does go on to give us some examples. The precise way to behave at a supermarket checkout, um, or in ordinary conversations.
So can, to be
Um,
honest, it's still I
I think what they're saying is that it will, I guess, a change that's happened here that might surprise people is we don't usually pay with cash. We used to pay with cash a lot. Maybe not over 9 years, but maybe over the last 15 or 20 years, that's changed a lot.
mm,
Also, automatic checkouts is a much bigger thing now than it was 10 years ago.
perfect.
But even how you might interact if there's someone at the checkout who's taking your money, how do you interact with them?
Mm.
Um,
And also, Adam, that mean frames of reference have changed. For example, uh, in the conversation you are talking to another person, how can the
so it's
frames of reference have changed?
yeah, so it's about what sorts of issues or assumptions or framing ideas you might build your conversation inside. So, what sorts of things would be referred to? How do people talk about everyday life? Or how do people talk about things like the weather? Or how do people talk about things like government? That all might have changed. Um,
The frame of reference is usually talking about the
so
whether
it's
government or I don't
no,
know
it's talking about the how. How
how.
do people, what sorts of things do you refer to when you have an everyday conversation? How do you refer to them?
Can you give us an example? For example, 9 years ago, you wanted to describe the government of the United States, for example. How do you describe it? And now how it changed? Give us an example, imaginary example.
So I'm actually thinking it's something more like, um, do people talk to each other in public in certain ways? I think you might find that people are less friendly now, or there's less of an ethos of customer service, because a lot of processes are automated.
You're right.
Um, I think that might be the difference, the kinds of differences they're talking about. So the frame of reference is like, what are the assumptions about how we should interact with each other? Um, but also some other things will have changed. And like if we're talking about government, I think you might have heard more people say things like, "Oh, you know, complaining about, um,
Now they talk about complaining. Yeah, they don't like any of the government in the United States. I talked to some Americans.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah." So it might be that 10 years ago people
they
would
were
say
optimistic. Yeah,
things like, "Yeah, I'm hoping that things will get
they're
better after
change.
the
Yeah,
next election," but now people are saying things like,
they don't believe
"Oh,
in anything.
things are worse and they're getting worse. They're going to
Yeah,
keep getting worse."
yeah, great, perfect.
So those kinds of frames of reference might be in place as well.
Mm.
And when talking about work, like if you were talking about work life 10 years ago, almost no one was working remotely. Now, there's a question of what days do you go into the office? It's not like I'll see you in the office. It's like what days will you be there? Should we meet on Zoom?
Mm. Yeah, great.
That
Thank
that will all have changed as well.
Perfect.